Service Lab is a community of service design doers and the service design curious. We meet up every few months to share our learnings with each other.
Hello everybody, I'm Katie Wyburd. I'm a director in the strategy and growth team here at Idean.
My name's Alex. I'm a product designer here at Idean. Boo. And we're here today to talk to you guys about inclusive design and really how we think it can play a role in vulnerability in financial services.
Yeah, so as Charlie said when she was introing us, this is something that we've been working on over the past year, really. It started to pick up. It's becoming quite a hot topic that we're discussing with our clients. And we wanted to share some of the thinking and where we've got to so far with that. So the three things that we're going to cover off today are financial vulnerability and how much of a problem it is, how we believe inclusive design can help with that, and some starting points. I think quite often we find that when we start to talk about financial vulnerability and we talk about inclusive design, it can become quite theoretical, and we want to bring it to, want to make it quite practical. I think some of the clients that we're talking to can be quite paralysed by the size, the scope of this as a challenge. So we want to bring some of the practical points that we've been discussing with them and share them with you. So I want to ask you a question to start off. What percentage would you say of the UK population would struggle to cope with a surprise bill of, say, £300? What percentage? Any guesses?
60, 70.
Yeah.
40, 60.
Yeah, so it is quite high, right? It's actually nearly 50%. So that's half of the population who, if they suddenly got stuck with a bill for 300 quid to fix the fridge or replace the fridge or fix the car, that would be a real struggle for them. I think it's something that feels like it should be quite counterintuitive. We know that employment is on the up, as are wages, inflation is low. It shouldn't be like that, but it's very much the case. We know the household debt's at an all-time high of £15,000 per household. So it's a very real issue. So we've got some statistics. You guys clearly know how big an issue this is if you're quoting those sorts of percentages. So, but we don't just need percentages to give us a steer on this. It's something that we hear. So when we're conducting customer research with certain segments for certain projects that we've been working on, we hear this from people that we speak to. Sometimes it's quite shocking, the lengths to which some of the people that we're speaking to need to go to make ends meet on a monthly basis, or what happens when they get that surprise bill, especially when it's more than £300. If it's £1,000, then it can be really sticky. So we feel that this is a really big issue. It's something that's not really being talked about enough, or certainly not enough is being done about it. So the organisations that need to drive this change need a real burning platform to do it, right? So the Financial Conduct Authority is increasing their focus on this. They're publishing more about it, but they're being quite vague about the direction that's being given. So currently, their definition of vulnerability is really vague, and the guidance that they're giving is not specific enough. We are seeing some sorts of changes within these organisations, but I think more could be done to create more of a burning platform. It's hard, though, to make the case for that platform when the business model's not quite there. A lot of the products that some organisations are selling to these financially vulnerable people make the money on them not being able to pay it. So until we can really shift that business model, it's quite hard to encourage the change that is needed. However, scrutiny is increasing, and I think as the FCA get more of a grip on it, we'll start to see more of a change. Ultimately, we don't want it to turn into another PPI scandal, which is what some people feel could happen because of the amount of mis-selling that's going on. So there's a big opportunity there. We think it's massive, right? So if it's actually tackled, this could be life-changing for up to 50% of the population. And if we want to and have the motivation to, I think it's something that we could shape the response to. None of the organisations that we've spoken to, and we've spoken to a lot of the big retail banks about this, no one wants to be the first mover. And I think because the FCA aren't forcing that yet, no one's really stepping up. However, I think for those that genuinely do, will see a massive change in the customer acquisition. If that's something that they led on, there's a huge proportion of the country that would be like, yes, brilliant, this is actually going to help me rather than make my situation worse. So that's the kind of cause that we want to champion and are going after. But before I go into more detail, Alex is just going to give you a bit of a view of who we're talking about.
Yeah, so I was going to try the clicker, but I'm not going to risk it because then you're in a strange order. Vulnerability is a strange thing. What do we mean, vulnerability? There's a lot of ways of talking about this. There's a lot of definitions kicking about around how to think about and address vulnerability. I guess in addition to that, accessibility and usability are ever-increasing topics, rightfully so. But we're also starting to think, as an industry, I think, about how ethics is becoming to play a part, especially with the data, GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know who's read the Mike Monteiro book. If you haven't, you should. It's fascinating. But actually, vulnerability, we think is slightly different to all of those things. The reason for that is because we don't think there's such thing as a vulnerable customer. We don't think there's such thing as a vulnerable segment. This is not something that you can kind of compartmentalize. We think that everybody has the potential to be vulnerable. This is about people, everyday people, who find themselves in vulnerable situations. We're talking about existing customers of businesses who will at some stage find them in a situation, in a moment, in a place in time that makes them vulnerable. It's a state. It can happen to any of us. It might be that you are pregnant, or that you've had a baby and that your hands are full and that you're tired and fatigued and you can't focus. Or that you're drunk and you've had too much and you're on the way home and you're
fine in the morning, but you could switch into that state and then go out again.
And we all know that Monzo feature where that late night purchase or that third round is flagged. And they're really interesting ways to think about this. But actually, something else that's starting to play a part really is the fact that, the difficulty of classification scares financial institutions because it's hard to classify, because it's hard to codify, it's hard to approach as a result. And so actually the barriers are just remaining higher. We like to talk about vulnerability in this way. It's helped us shape our research, it's helped us shape our solutions and our starting points. So we think it's a person in a position or a situation that means they are unable to, or they're impaired in their ability to make a decision that's in their best interest. And really, because there's no such thing as a vulnerable customer, it's not about how you deal with someone who has that label on them, but it's about anticipating vulnerability. How do you anticipate vulnerability? We think that the right approach is an inclusive one, and taking inclusive design principles and applying them so that we can preempt vulnerability and try and help people build resistance to those situations.
So that's why we are very big advocates of the inclusive design approach. So our definition for it is, as you can see here, so it's the design of mainstream products or services that are accessible to, usable by, and enjoyable for as many people as possible. So that, by looking at that as the definition, that immediately eradicates any concerns you have around segments and who's what. Because if you're doing it for everybody, then it doesn't matter. You don't need to work out specific segments and have a view of all these different variations of vulnerability that the customer base will have. So the model that we most frequently use to describe how inclusive design can work is this one. So I think quite often, as Alex was saying, it can be quite paralysing. The financial vulnerability group of people is so big. And now, inclusive design is great, but it's not going to solve for everything. We feel that it can, I'm just going to go here, it can cover a significant chunk of this pyramid, right? So currently, most products and services are sitting here, which I'm sure you will have experienced. I think accessible design is a thing, and that has helped, but actually it's gone nowhere near as far enough, and that helps with some minimal access needs. But actually, inclusive design should be able to go all the way to here, if done properly. Admittedly, there's always going to be those who have severe access needs. I think we need to be very honest with ourselves in terms of the remit for inclusive design. Some people just need to have very particular care, and I think it's okay to admit that. We can focus on a significant chunk of the population, but we can't get that top bucket.
I think one interesting element of that as well is that lowers the bar, that lowers the barrier to entry, That makes it easier to think about because if you think about it in that way, in those very specific, severe circumstances, and we acknowledge they require specific responses, then actually it becomes an easier thing to start talking about with the people that are creating the products and services at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So, where do you begin? How do you start to include all of these people who are in such a broad range of situations and of vulnerable situations? We all know the answer, right? It's not rocket science. And that's kind of one of the main things that we're here to talk to you guys today about. We know that designing inclusively needs to consider that broad range of points of view. Because the main benefit of inclusive design is its broad ambition and the way it looks to cater for as many people as possible. So we started our process months ago, really focusing in on the stories that can tell about these people's situations as best as they can, exploring kind of really widely different circumstances, the spectrum of vulnerability, the different types of challenges that people are going through. And these stories and these people are at the heart of the starting points that we're going to cover in a minute and the solutions that sit within those starting points. Just to give you guys an idea of the types of situations that we've been able to dig into. Brian, or we'll call him Brian, and we'll call her Linda, and we'll call her Jenny, and we'll call her Amy, is somebody who's entering old age and is really struggling with the deterioration of his cognition and some potential influences in his life that are looking to capitalize on that. We spoke to Linda, who actually is in the midst of a problematic marriage and subsequently a problematic divorce and is struggling with financial manipulation. We spoke to Jenny, who actually represents refugees arriving to the country, deals with them on a daily basis, told us stories of their struggles with access and with independence once they get here. And we spoke to Amy, who has an amazing story of how her personal debt spiraled out of control very, very quickly in an alarming way. So you can see the kind of broad range of circumstances that even just through, a handful of conversations, you're starting to try and cater for with this type of stuff. But actually, we think that if you, that research led us into kind of 4 ways into how to start thinking about this and how to kind of make the problems a little bit more manageable. We think that actually, if you make connections and connections in your services and in the services that your customers experience, and you start to think about how you can give autonomy to the right people at the right time within the business, you can start to do 2 things. You can start to give people the right type of support in the right way at the right time. You can also empower the customer or the person who needs empowering at the end process. And end of the process, we'll get onto that in a moment. What we will do is just move through these and give you guys an idea of what initial solutions could look like, just to articulate our thinking and explore what's possible in these spaces.
And these aren't completely exclusive, right? There are many other principles and starting points, but these are the ones that just came out of our research and that we've felt kind of helped move the conversation along.
How many for time? I'm going to be quick. I'll try and run through 4 starting points, just a quick discussion around each. What do we mean by connectivity? We think it's about just a coherent approach, a holistic view of the customer, connecting the services that they experience so that the blockers to their successes are as low and as minimal as they possibly can be. What can good connectivity look like? Well, actually, we can talk about connecting services for one business, but what do we start talking about connecting services across multiple businesses? What if I've been defrauded, and instead of just being told about that by my bank knows who my email provider is, they know who my service providers are, and they can stitch that up to be a coherent experience for me when I'm in a vulnerable situation. What about if we intervene at the point of transaction and actually say, do you know what? You might not realize this, but you're about to go overdrawn with this. Are you sure you want to go through with that? You can start to see some of those solutions in the kind of sort of public eye or kind of mainstream right now. They aren't rocket science. They're sort of tweaks to existing experiences, but they do apply to people with huge amount of types of access needs, and really striving to design for the many, not the few, is what this stuff is really all about. We'll keep going. Autonomy is really important, giving people control where they need it internally, giving people the tools to kind of capitalize on the empathy and the trust that the customer might have with them if they're a customer-facing employee on the shop floor. It also helps with creating that culture internally where people feel that they can act on the stuff that they think they might have spotted. If you think back to Brian, struggling with his cognitive decline, concerned family about his state of affairs and the people that are looking to influence his life. Actually, what if we use friction as a force for good? You know, in a situation where somebody might be accessing someone's current account or transactions, you know, if you can't prove that you know what that transaction was for, then maybe it shouldn't be going ahead. Alternatively, you know, if you think about those relationships that people can end up building up on the front line, what about if we give them the opportunity to kind of spot inconsistencies and spot warning signs and flag them up and start discussions around them? You can see how this stuff impacts people, but you can also hopefully see how it impacts the businesses. If you can nail some of this stuff early and sort of strike while the iron's hot, then the time involved, the money involved, and all of the efforts involved in recuperating some of the effects of these situations makes that sell for inclusivity a much easier one to the people who hold the purse strings. If we think about support, then, you know, actually, how can you combine those first two things so that you can give people who are in situations like this the right support at the right time? Becoming flexible, becoming more inclusive to do so. If you think back to Linda, she was in an abusive relationship. She was being manipulated financially. Her calls were being monitored. Her emails were being monitored. Her current account was being monitored. Her husband and now ex-husband knew everything about her. And in that situation, asking for help can be really, really, really hard. How does she do that if she knows that he's going to find out? Well, could there be a way in which you dial 9999 at the cash point and flag that to your bank provider or your current account provider or your bank? Alternatively, actually, if you think back to the refugees that Jenny was kind of introducing into the country, their language issues, their kind of digital literacy issues, it's very possible that those people don't understand what they've entered into with a financial service or product. I don't understand half the time. I'm currently in the midst of an insurance battle and I'm absolutely hamstrung by my lack of knowledge of what's happening. And I'm not especially vulnerable, I'm competent, I've entered into this stuff willingly, so you can see how it can spiral out of control. But what if we gave people tests in private to boost their own confidence and just to make sure that they knew what they were doing and that what they had already done was what they meant to do? And yeah, I think, you know, we can start to think about this stuff in a slightly different way. Yes, it's a bit of a challenge to a customer to think about like that, but we can start to build relationships between businesses and customers on a completely different level and think about that in a completely different way.
It's all around the positioning. If we can get the positioning right, it's not going to be patronising. So as long as we can get that right up front, then...
You can see that these are sort of slightly speculative and starter thoughts, but hopefully they start to trigger the right types of conversations. Finally, again, in the interest of time, empowerment, and this is a huge one. I think, you know, on the surface, empowerment is about empowering the direct user. It's about giving them experiences and processes that work for them so that they can be in control. But actually, one other way of thinking about this is challenging who needs to be empowered. Again, if we think back to Brian, who was sort of struggling cognitively and had some influences in his life that may have been slightly less than savoury, actually, can we give power of attorney to people and empower the right people in that situation, not just the person who's on paper supposed to be in control? 5-minute warning, thank you very much. So, you know, can we assign permission or sign off on transactions to loved ones? Can we give loved ones visibility on current accounts just so they can keep a track of what's going on?
And particularly with an ageing population, this is only going to become more and more relevant.
Yeah, and the gap in sort of digital literacy between ourselves and the generations above us is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That was a little bit of a rush through. We just wanted to try and get through that to give you guys an idea of what we're thinking about, how we're starting to think about this stuff, and just sort of provoking some conversations that hopefully take us a little step in the right direction. Just to recap, you know, we think that actually, if you design inclusively and you think about this stuff a little bit more carefully, you can start to, you know, connect services really well, both within your business or within the business that's creating these products and services and beyond. And you can start to hopefully give autonomy to the people that really need it and let them put it to use with their experience. That lets us give better types of support to people, that lets us give autonomy in the right place and to the right people, so that everybody can sort of, you know, succeed a little bit more productively.
Yeah, so as Alex was saying, these are, and as I jumped in to say, they're not the answer. They're just some of the things that can be done to help improve the experience for vulnerable users across financial products and services. I think they can just start the conversation when it can feel really overwhelming, and then very practical things that we've been stressing to some of the clients that we've been talking about this feels probably quite straightforward, and I would hope that these are the things that you guys would already know about, but this is what is starting to kind of resonate. One is that it always surprises us when not truly representative customers are brought in. It's really hard to build empathy if you haven't actually spoken to, like we have now, the variety of people that you need to be solving for. So I think by building that empathy and bringing that into the client organisation is really helpful, and starts to immediately shift that view to who we're designing for. And I think it doesn't stop there. So the second point is what to design with this group. You can't just bring them in for testing. Often we ask the question about how inclusive the testing is. So we had someone who uses a wheelchair or who's blind. And it's just a very token effort and isn't at all kind of representative of the size and the scale and the different types of vulnerability that sit within this group. Shifting the mindset again. So if you can do these two, that often helps with the third, but really pushing that. And I think particularly in financial organisations, some of the clients that we work with can be quite removed, but really bringing that inclusive mindset makes a massive difference. And then lastly, we're never done. And I think we know this with our work, right? So it's constantly an iterative process. Not necessarily what everyone always wants to hear, but that's the honest truth of it. So
yeah.
We have a couple of things of content.
Yeah, two final things. That work that we've just spoken to, or at least sort of the main part of the content within that is something that's about to manifest in a microsite. That's going to be available soon. We are by no means the people within this business, or within this room actually, who contribute to this. So, shout out to those guys. Charlie was one of them. There are more. Amanda, I can't, there she is, excuse me.
Shout out to Jane for doing amazing illustrations.
Yeah, so it's a business effort, it's a team effort, but it's important that we get it out there as quickly as we can, because we think it's something that we're proud of. That'll be landing soon. Hopefully we can maybe try and get the link out to you guys slightly early. Don't know if that's possible, but it's a nice aspiration.
Yeah, very keen to get feedback on it.
Yes, and then the second thing, actually, Charlie, cards. What's the situation?
Coming soon, but we need to tell them a little bit what the cards are.
So the cards are Cards Humanity is a game, and it's a sort of slightly provocative game that Charlie has almost single-handedly, I think, put together.
We've got lots of really lovely helpers.
That just challenge people in the design of a product or service, and force them through a series of exercises to just think about certain situations from a different point of view. We're striving to get those out. We're striving to get the prototypes shipped to as many people as we can. I actually think there's a sort of download and print type link that people will begin to access quite soon. Feedback on both of those things is going to be hugely appreciated, especially from the likes of you guys who are obviously here showing a willing interest, have the expertise, have the background, and will hopefully help us make these things as good as they possibly can be.
So to wrap up, hopefully you've felt this from what we've been telling you, but we really feel that this is becoming a business imperative. It's not going to be something which can be an afterthought anymore. It's something that really should be a key consideration for all new products and services. And we've been particularly focusing on financial services most recently, but it's very relevant across all products and services. We've touched on a little bit of work here with a utility company. It's a very real basic need for lots of people to be able to access warmth, particularly in this country. So it's something which can be applied against all the work that we do. And we hope that it's something that you found interesting. If you ever want to talk to us about it, we have a lot to say about this. We've condensed it down as much as we could. So please just come and grab us if you want to discuss further.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Go on.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. I'll come over to you with the mic. Everyone just stick your hand up if anyone's got any. That was a very vicious...
You don't have to, it's fine.
Always good to have an enthusiastic first question. Thanks very much, that's really, really interesting. I heartily agree with your first step around building empathy with truly representative users. And like I said earlier, I think it's fair to assume that you can't engage with everyone that you would sometimes like to. So how have you prioritised who are your truly representative users?
Good question.
In terms of who we tried to speak to, or who we kind of think, how you set out your approach, is that what you mean?
Maybe a bit of both.
So I can go first on that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we are partnering with our parent company, Capgemini, on this. So one thing that probably should have mentioned during this is that inclusive design is part of this, but to tackle this as a whole, you need to look at the process, you need to have the data, you have all the identification, and that's what we're partnering with on them. So they're actually developing a model using data from a very large bank to help create a model in which you can identify particular peaks in types of vulnerability in your customer group. So that in itself is big. So what we're discussing with current clients is how you focus on one product area to start off with. So one in particular that we've been looking at is mortgages. So we're applying that model to a product group and then identifying and then focusing that way. There is no perfect way to do it. And I think also whilst there's no particular, as I was saying, burning platform or particular business case, that's one method that we're trying currently. We'll see how it works. I'll let you know.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Sorry, just this. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Go on, right now.
Hi, you right now.
I'm Jez, service designer from Deloitte Digital.
Wicked, thank you. Thanks for your question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Josephsberg. I can't even say my own name. Sarah Josephsberg, patient experience and user involvement lead for London Cancer Alliance, North East and Central London Cancer Alliance. It's so long. Work for the NHS.
Time up.
Yeah, but I'm an undercover service designer, so I'm doing that. But I was just wondering. I was thinking of patients I worked with, and you know how you were talking about friction, and I was thinking how sometimes friction creates a situation that actually puts the person who's vulnerable at risk. And I wondered how, what safe gaps or stop safes were in place. Because, if you're a little nan with someone who's bearing over you and they're answer the question because they're with you, and someone's kind of being held hostage to answer the questions, how does that, it's fine if someone's stolen your details and is doing it remotely, but if they're with you, how do you then stop that becoming abuse or escalating,
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's quite the situation. And I think, I don't necessarily know if we have the answer, right? But I think what's interesting is how you think about exploring the possibilities that people do have. Like, for example, that cash machine thing where there's a moment there where she might be able to take a quick second to flag something and walk away as if nothing ever happened. I appreciate that's a slightly kind of abstract solution and not necessarily the answer to your question, but I think different strokes for different folks, right? Because you're right, if someone's being coerced into proving that the situation or the transaction is legitimate, then we've failed. And you need to think quite carefully about how that's kind of executed.
Yeah, I think it's a two-pronged approach in situations like this. So building on the data, what we're trying to do is also plot all these markers across accounts. So enable the staff, but have the intelligence and the algorithms to be able to run and assess different accounts and odd behaviour. So her behaviour may be changing because this person is overbearing now, and that if the markers are working correctly, then we'll start to get the flags on that. Being brave enough to act on it is another thing, because that's quite hard if you get it wrong. So that's something which, in the discussions we're having, we're still really early in development, but I think it's applying the inclusive design approach to processes that are new and as you revisit them, but also having the underlying markers. It's a kind of real two-pronged approach, I think.
I was thinking there'd be a delay in response and you would time it if you think about it. And then if there's a delay beyond a certain point, it triggers something.
Yeah, exactly. So these are all the sorts of things that you could
implement. No, it's really interesting.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question. Oh, I hate this. This is so hard. I'm sorry. I think you were first.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. I'm Stefano, by the way. Just because you mentioned before the business model, so what was the business case to implement this thing, or what would be your business case to implement the thing with an actual business, because some of them don't really bring money, but just good. It's ethical to actually do them, but some people don't care about that.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I think, a couple of things that we spoke to earlier, one of the ways in which you might interpret that and respond to that particular challenge, because you're right, it's not a business imperative. Hopefully the regulations that are coming into place might mean that it becomes part of a conversation and is accelerated to becoming part of the conversation more quickly. But actually, if you think about it in terms of the savings or the kind of time and additional processes involved in recuperating from the knock-on effects of some of these situations, I think that's one way of beginning to try and have that conversation and having the people who do hold the purse strings listen to that conversation. It's a very good question. It's a very good question because, you're right. People want to do this. It's very easy to pay lip service to, but when it hits the bottom line, or if it doesn't hit the bottom line, then it's going to become way less compelling for some of these people. Right?
That's why we need it to be more mandated. That's why we need the SCA to be a bit more specific in their guidance or even criteria for the organisations. I think when we've tried to look at this before and change the business models of certain products to instead profit on people who default and end up paying huge interest charges, we've tried to flip it around so that the upfront charges are flat and fair and communicated. So if you actually sit and look at the two options side by side, so one where you incur lots of interest and one where you pay fee upfront, often the fee upfront feels quite high, and that's where we struggle with the communication. But actually, if you sit and compare to what you could be paying if you really default, you'd actually much want to go for the flat and upfront transparent option. And that's how I think there's a lot more consumer transparency that's now being expected across many different sectors, and I feel that that's the way it will ultimately go. But getting those conversations, we've tried on various projects, and at the moment we're not getting the support to be able to actually push them through. But we'll keep trying.
Can I get another massive round of applause for Alex and Katie?